The rain over Chicago beat relentlessly against the towering glass facade of the Obsidian Corp headquarters, casting long, dreary shadows across the immaculate marble floors of the main lobby. It was 8:15 a.m., the peak of the morning rush. A sea of sharp suits and clicking heels moved with frantic urgency, every employee terrified of being even a minute late. But the icy chill of the November morning was nothing compared to the freezing arrogance radiating from the man striding through the front doors. Julian Vance, the newly appointed chief executive officer, moved with the rigid, terrifying entitlement of a man who believed the world existed solely to serve him. Clad in a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than a luxury car, his face was locked in a permanent, disdainful sneer. He was a corporate tyrant, known for firing people in elevators just to stroke his own ego. He viewed kindness as a fatal flaw and empathy as a fireable offense. As Julian marched toward his private express elevator, followed closely by a swarm of trembling junior executives, his expensive Italian leather shoes squeaked sharply. He had stepped on a slightly damp patch of marble. He didn't slip, but the momentary loss of his perfect, intimidating composure made his jaw clench with a volcanic rage. Standing less than 10 feet away, gripping a worn wooden mop handle, was Elias. He was an elderly man, his frail, weathered frame swallowed by a faded, oversized gray janitor's uniform. His silver hair was neatly parted, and his deep, intelligent eyes held a lifetime of quiet observation. Elias had been a silent fixture in this grand building for years, working tirelessly to keep the empire spotless while the titans of industry walked right over his hard work without a single glance of gratitude. Julian snapped his head toward the old man, his eyes burning with venomous contempt. The entire lobby seemed to hold its collective breath. The chaotic morning chatter instantly died down into a suffocating, terrified silence. "You!" Julian barked, his voice slicing through the quiet lobby like a steel whip. "What in the absolute hell do you think you're doing, old man?" Elias did not flinch. He did not cower, nor did he frantically apologize like the other employees would have. He stood perfectly upright, resting his calloused hands on the mop, and looked directly into Julian's furious eyes. "I am doing my job, sir," Elias replied. His voice was raspy but terrifyingly calm, carrying a smooth, steady cadence that completely lacked the fear Julian was so accustomed to instilling. "I am cleaning the floors before the annual board meeting." Julian let out a harsh, mocking laugh, stepping aggressively into the elderly man's personal space. Towering over him, he was completely oblivious to the fact that he was standing on the absolute precipice of his own destruction. He had no idea that the frail old man he was about to humiliate was Elias Thorne, the ruthless billionaire founder, majority shareholder, and the true owner of the very building they were standing in. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Julian sneered, stepping so close that Elias could smell the sharp, expensive mint of his cologne. "I am the chief executive officer of Obsidian Corp. I dictate who breathes the air in this lobby. And you, with your pathetic little mop and your complete lack of situational awareness, are currently breathing my air." Elias simply blinked, his weathered hands tightening slightly on the wooden handle. He looked at Julian not with fear, but with the profound, exhausting disappointment of a father watching a child throw a senseless tantrum. "The floors were wet, Mr. Vance," Elias said, his voice carrying a quiet resonance that seemed to cut through the ambient anxiety of the room. "I was ensuring no one slipped. Safety is a priority in this building." "Safety?" Julian scoffed, his voice rising in pitch, practically vibrating with indignant fury. "You think I care about the safety of the cattle that walk through these doors? I care about perfection. I care about image. And right now, the image of my multi-billion-dollar enterprise is being tarnished by a decrepit old man who doesn't know how to stay out of the way of his betters." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd of employees. A young woman from marketing instinctively covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Even Julian's sycophantic entourage exchanged nervous glances. But Julian was completely drunk on his own perceived power. "What is your name, cleaner?" Julian demanded, snapping his fingers directly in Elias's face. "Elias," the old man replied softly. He did not offer his last name. He wanted to see exactly how deep this rot went. "Well, Elias," Julian mocked, a cruel, predatory smile twisting his features. "Consider this your early retirement. You are fired. Pack up your miserable little bucket, turn in your keycard, and get out of my building before I have you physically thrown out." Elias did not move. He stood his ground, an unmovable pillar amidst the corporate storm. "You do not have the authority to terminate my employment, Mr. Vance," Elias stated calmly. The audacity of the statement hit Julian like a physical blow. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. "I am the CEO," he roared. "I am the supreme authority. Security, get over here right now." Two heavily built security guards pushed their way through the crowd. They looked incredibly uncomfortable. They recognized Elias. Every veteran employee knew exactly who the quiet old man with the mop really was. The guards hesitated, exchanging panicked looks. "I said remove this garbage from my lobby." "Oh!" Julian screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Elias. The trap was set. Julian had just crossed the point of no return. The two security guards, Barnes and Miller, remained absolutely frozen in place. The heavy, suffocating silence in the lobby was deafening. Barnes, a veteran who had worked security at Obsidian Corp for over 15 years, looked at the screaming CEO, then back at the quiet, elderly man holding the mop. Barnes slowly lowered his hands from his utility belt, shaking his head slightly. "Sir?" Barnes started, his voice trembling as he addressed Julian. We can't do that, Mr. Vance. We can't touch him." Julian's meticulously groomed face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disbelief. He looked around the lobby, fully aware that hundreds of his subordinates were watching his ultimate authority being completely undermined by a minimum-wage rent-a-cop. "Excuse me?" Julian hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerously low, venomous register. "I am the Chief Executive Officer. I sign your paychecks. If you do not physically remove this janitor from my site in the next 5 seconds, I will have you both terminated, blacklisted, and thrown out on the street alongside him." "Actually, Mr. Vance, you do not sign their paychecks," Elias interrupted softly. The old man leaned the mop against the yellow plastic bucket, his movements slow but deliberate. He reached into the deep pocket of his faded gray uniform. "The payroll of Obsidian Corp is authorized by the board of directors, a board that, until recently, believed you possessed the temperament and the integrity to lead this company." Julian let out a sharp, arrogant bark of laughter. He took another step forward, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of dominance. "Are you lecturing me on corporate governance, old man? You wash floors for a living? You are nothing." Before Elias could respond, the chiming sound of the private executive elevator echoed through the silent, tense lobby. The polished steel doors slid open, and Victoria Sterling, the chief financial officer and second in command of the entire empire, stepped out. She was clutching a thick leather portfolio, reviewing documents for the morning board meeting. As she looked up and assessed the chaotic scene, the paralyzed security guards, the red-faced screaming CEO, and the elderly man in the janitor's uniform, all the color instantly drained from her flawless face. Victoria dropped her expensive leather briefcase. The heavy thud echoed across the marble floor like a gunshot. She completely ignored Julian and sprinted across the lobby, her high heels clicking frantically against the stone. "Mr. Thorne." Victoria gasped, stopping a few feet away from the old man and bowing her head with profound, terrifying reverence. I had no idea you were arriving so early. The boardroom isn't fully prepared for your inspection yet, sir." Julian froze. His arrogant sneer evaporated, replaced instantly by a sickening, hollow confusion. He looked at his CFO, a ruthless corporate shark who usually commanded absolute fear, now trembling and bowing before a cleaner. "Victoria," Julian stammered, pointing a shaking finger. "What in God's name are you doing? Why are you apologizing to the janitor?" Victoria slowly turned her head to look at Julian. Her eyes held the terrifying cold pity of someone looking at a dead man walking. "Julian," she whispered, her voice laced with absolute dread. "That is not a janitor. That is Elias Thorne, the founder, the majority shareholder, and the chairman of the board. You are screaming at the man who owns this entire building." The sheer magnitude of Victoria's words struck the lobby like a physical shockwave. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the cavernous marble atrium was the steady, miserable drumming of the rain against the exterior glass walls. Julian Vance's face, previously flushed with tyrannical rage, drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, chalky white. The breath caught in his throat, and his perfectly tailored, bespoke charcoal suit suddenly seemed to hang off his trembling frame like a cheap, oversized Halloween costume. He looked wildly from his terrified chief financial officer to the frail, elderly man leaning quietly against the yellow mop bucket. The catastrophic realization crashed down upon Julian with the crushing force of a collapsing skyscraper. He hadn't just insulted a low-level janitor. He had publicly humiliated the undisputed architect of the Obsidian Corp empire, the man who literally owned the marble floor beneath his squeaking Italian leather shoes. "Mr. Thorne, I didn't," Julian stammered, his voice cracking, completely stripped of its former venomous authority. The dominant corporate shark was instantly replaced by a pathetic, weeping coward desperately trying to salvage his life. "I was told you were on a medical sabbatical in Europe. The uniform, I didn't recognize you." "I swear, it was just a misunderstanding about building safety protocols." Elias did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He slowly removed the faded company baseball cap, running a calloused hand through his silver hair. In that single, simple gesture, he shed the persona of the invisible cleaner and radiated the supreme, unquestionable authority of a billionaire titan. "It was not a misunderstanding, Mr. Vance," Elias said, his voice echoing smoothly in the dead silence of the room, carrying the weight of absolute judgment. "It was a revelation. For the past month, I have scrubbed the floors of my own company. I emptied the wastebaskets in the executive suites. I stood invisibly in the corners of the elevators." Elias took a slow, deliberate step toward the trembling CEO, leaving the mop behind. "I built this empire on the strict foundation of respect and integrity. But I started hearing troubling rumors from the lower levels, whispers of a new executive regime that ruled by fear. A leadership that treated our hardest-working employees like disposable cattle. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. I needed to see how you treated people when you thought they had absolutely no power to fight back." Julian took a pathetic half-step back, his hands shaking uncontrollably. All around them, the hundreds of employees in the lobby, people Julian had terrorized, belittled, and threatened for weeks, watched his ultimate downfall with wide, vindicated eyes. The silence was suffocating, heavy with the absolute certainty of his impending destruction. "And what I saw," Elias continued, his cold, intelligent gaze piercing through Julian's soul like a serrated steel blade, was a man entirely unfit to lead. A fragile, arrogant little bully who confuses cruelty with strength. The silence that followed Elias Thorne's damning assessment was absolute. Julian Vance, a man who had built his entire career on terrorizing those beneath him, seemed to physically shrink under the crushing weight of the billionaire's gaze. His bespoke charcoal suit now looked like a cage. Sweat beaded on Julian's forehead, completely ruining his meticulously styled hair, and his chest heaved as panic finally overrode his arrogance. "Mr. Thorne, please," Julian begged, his voice reduced to a pathetic, trembling whisper. He raised his hands in a desperate gesture of surrender, taking a tentative step toward the elderly man. "You must understand the immense pressure of this position. The board demanded aggressive restructuring and immediate results. I was simply trying to maintain the elite standards of Obsidian Corp. If you just give me one more chance, I can align perfectly with your vision. I can change my approach." Elias did not move an inch. He looked at Julian with the cold, detached precision of a surgeon examining a malignant tumor that needed to be immediately excised. "My vision for this company, Mr. Vance, has always been built on the fundamental belief that a corporation is only as strong as the people who maintain it," Elias stated, his voice resonating powerfully through the cavernous lobby. From the executives in the top-floor boardroom to the men and women who scrubbed these floors at dawn, You did not demand elite standards. You demanded absolute subservience to feed your own fragile ego. Elias turned his attention away from the weeping CEO and looked at his chief financial officer, who was still standing rigidly nearby, clutching her leather portfolio. Victoria. Yes, Mr. Thorne? Victoria responded instantly, her voice crisp and fiercely professional, desperately eager to distance herself from Julian's rapidly sinking ship. Draft the termination papers for Mr. Vance immediately, Elias commanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate or negotiation. Ensure that his termination is officially categorized under gross misconduct and a direct violation of our core corporate ethics. Strip him of his unvested stock options and completely cancel his executive severance package. Julian let out a strangled gasp, his knees actually buckling slightly as the reality of his financial ruin set in. You can't do that. My contract guarantees a golden parachute. Your contract includes a strict morality and conduct clause, Julian. Victoria interrupted coldly, her eyes flashing with ruthless corporate efficiency. And verbally abusing a senior staff member, let alone the chairman of the board, in front of 200 employee witnesses is a textbook violation. You are leaving this building with absolutely nothing. Elias then turned his deep gray gaze toward the two security guards, Barnes and Miller, who were still standing by the reception desk. A faint, respectful smile touched the corners of the old man's mouth. Mr. Barnes, Elias said softly. Yes, sir. Barnes replied, standing taller, a profound sense of vindication and pride washing over his face. Mr. Vance was very concerned about the air quality in this lobby earlier, Elias noted, expertly throwing the tyrant's arrogant insult right back at him. Would you please do the honors of escorting our former chief executive officer out of my building? He is no longer authorized to breathe our air. The lobby of the Obsidian Corp headquarters, usually a sanctuary of hushed, fearful whispers, erupted into a profound, suffocating silence. It was the kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift. Sergeant Barnes, the veteran security guard whom Julian had threatened to blacklist and throw out on the street just moments prior, slowly stepped forward. He unhooked the heavy radio from his belt, his eyes locked onto the now trembling, pathetic figure of the former chief executive officer. You heard the chairman, Barnes said, his voice dropping the deferential tone he had been forced to use with Julian for months. It was replaced by the firm, uncompromising authority of a man who finally had the law and the absolute power of the building's owner on his side. It's time for you to leave the premises, Mr. Vance, immediately. Julian shrank back, his expensive bespoke charcoal suit suddenly looking ridiculous against his pale, sweating skin. He looked frantically at the sea of employees surrounding them. Just 10 minutes ago, they were his terrified subjects, cowering at his every footstep. Now, hundreds of eyes stared back at him with unadulterated, victorious contempt. There was no pity. No one stepped forward to defend the tyrant. They watched with bated breath, savoring the absolute destruction of a man who had made their lives a living hell. You can't do this to me, Julian shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. The arrogant, untouchable corporate shark was entirely gone, leaving behind nothing but a weeping, entitled bully. I built the Q3 revenue strategy. I have powerful friends in Chicago. You are making a catastrophic mistake, Elias. You need me. Elias Thorne remained perfectly still, resting his weathered hands on the wooden handle of his mop. He looked at Julian not with anger, but with the cold, absolute indifference reserved for a stain that had finally been wiped clean. Obsidian Corp does not need a leader who fundamentally despises the people doing the heavy lifting, Elias stated, his voice resonating with a quiet, devastating power. We need integrity. You possess none. Your desk will be packed into cardboard boxes and left at the loading dock. If you attempt to contact any of my board members, or if you ever set foot within 50 feet of this property again, my legal team will bury you in so many injunctions you won't be able to afford a bus ticket out of the city. Julian opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat as Miller, the second, much larger security guard, stepped up right beside Barnes. Miller didn't say a word. He simply placed a heavy, uncompromising hand on Julian's shoulder, forcefully turning him toward the rotating glass doors. "Walk," Barnes commanded. The march of shame began. Julian Vance, who had entered the lobby like an emperor, was now being physically paraded out like a common trespasser. As he was escorted past the reception desk, the quiet began to break. A slow, rhythmic clapping started from the back of the crowd. It was an older woman from accounting, someone Julian had publicly berated just last week. The applause spread like wildfire. Within seconds, the entire lobby erupted into deafening cheers and applause. It was a thunderous standing ovation, not for a quarterly profit margin, but for the swift, brutal execution of absolute justice. Julian covered his face with his hands, weeping openly as the heavy glass doors pushed him out into the freezing, relentless Chicago rain. The security guards stood at the entrance, arms crossed, watching him stumble onto the wet pavement, completely stripped of his power, his wealth, and his dignity. Inside the warm, gleaming lobby, Elias Thorne quietly picked up his mop bucket and turned to his shocked, newly liberated employees. The heavy glass doors of the Obsidian Corp headquarters slid shut, sealing the freezing Chicago rain and the disgraced former CEO outside in the cold. Inside the grand, marble-floored lobby, the thunderous applause slowly subsided, replaced by a profound, awestruck silence. Hundreds of employees stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the frail, elderly man in the faded gray janitor's uniform who had just single-handedly dismantled a tyrant. Elias Thorne did not bask in the applause. He calmly reached down, gripped the wooden handle of his mop, and placed it neatly into the yellow plastic bucket. He adjusted his collar and turned to face the sea of shocked, liberated workers. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried a warm, grounding authority that reached every corner of the vast atrium. Obsidian Corp was not founded on intimidation, and it will never be sustained by fear, Elias stated, his deep gray eyes sweeping across the crowd. A leader who does not respect the people sweeping the floors has absolutely no right to sit in the executive boardroom. You are the lifeblood of this empire. From the mailroom to the top floor, your dignity is non-negotiable. A collective, shuddering sigh of relief rippled through the lobby. Shoulders relaxed, and tears of genuine gratitude welled up in the eyes of several junior executives who had lived in daily terror of Julian's wrath. Elias turned his attention back to Victoria, the chief financial officer, who was still standing at strict attention. "Victoria," Elias said, his tone shifting back to sharp corporate precision. "I want a full, unredacted audit of every policy Julian Vance implemented during his brief, disastrous tenure. You will immediately reverse any mandate that compromised employee welfare. Furthermore, I want a complete review of HR complaints that were buried over the last 3 months. Anyone who aided his toxic regime will be joining him on the sidewalk by noon." "Yes, Mr. Thorne." "Right away." Victoria nodded frantically, her fingers already flying across her tablet to initiate the purge. Finally, Elias looked at the 2 security guards, Barnes and Miller, who had just returned to their posts at the front desk. "Gentlemen," Elias smiled softly, "your integrity today was impeccable. Please inform payroll that you are both receiving an immediate promotion to head of executive security, along with a 20% raise." Barnes's jaw dropped. Thank you, sir." Elias gave a curt nod. He left the mop bucket behind and walked slowly toward the private executive elevator. The crowd naturally parted for him like the Red Sea, bowing their heads in profound respect. He stepped into the polished steel cabin, not as a forgotten cleaner, but as the undisputed king reclaiming his throne. The doors slid shut, carrying him upward, leaving behind a company reborn. The polished mahogany doors of the penthouse boardroom stood tall and imposing, guarding the absolute nerve center of Obsidian Corp. Inside, 12 of the most powerful board members in the city sat in plush leather chairs, sipping artisanal espresso and checking their luxury watches. It was exactly 8:45 a.m. They were eagerly awaiting the arrival of Julian Vance to present the aggressive Q3 restructuring plan, a ruthless, strategy that involved liquidating 3 regional branches and terminating thousands of loyal employees simply to artificially inflate their quarterly dividends. The atmosphere was one of cold, calculated greed. High above the rain-soaked streets of Chicago, they believed they were entirely untouchable. The sudden, sharp chime of the private executive elevator echoing through the antechamber made several heads turn. The heavy oak doors swung open, but it was not their perfectly tailored, arrogant CEO who walked through. It was Elias Thorne. He was still wearing the faded, slightly damp gray janitor's uniform. His worn company baseball cap clutched quietly in his calloused hands. The room, previously buzzing with billion-dollar chatter, instantly plummeted into a deathly, suffocating silence. A few of the newer board members, who had only seen the legendary founder in oil paintings, blinked in utter confusion at the frail, elderly cleaner intruding on their corporate sanctuary. But the veterans, the ones who had smiled to Elias's face while quietly voting to implement Julian's ruthless policies, behind his back went as pale as ghosts. The clinking of porcelain coffee cups stopped mid-air. Elias did not say a single word as he walked the length of the expansive room. He moved with the slow, deliberate, and terrifying grace of an apex predator returning to a den that had been overrun by arrogant scavengers. He bypassed the empty chair reserved for the CEO and moved directly to the head of the table, the chairman's seat, which had remained ceremonially vacant for the past year. He slowly pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down, resting his calloused hands on the polished mahogany wood. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," Elias said, his voice raspy but echoing with absolute, crushing authority. "I apologize for my attire. I have spent the last 4 weeks scrubbing the marble floors you walk on, emptying the wastebaskets in your offices, and listening to the terrified whispers of the people you employ." Richard Sterling, a senior board member who had personally championed Julian's promotion, nervously adjusted his silk tie, sweat already beading on his forehead. "Elias, Mr. Thorne, we thought you were in Geneva. Julian assured us you were on an extended medical leave." Julian Vance is currently standing on the wet pavement outside this building, entirely unemployed and stripped of his equity, Elias stated coldly, his deep gray eyes piercing through Richard like a serrated steel blade. The collective gasp in the room was audible. He was a tyrant, but a tyrant cannot rule without a complicit court. Elias leaned forward, the faded fabric of his janitor uniform contrasting violently with the immense power radiating from his posture. "I built this company to build communities, not to extract every ounce of blood from the working class for a slight bump in your stock portfolios. Julian was the disease, yes, but looking around this table, I see exactly who compromised my immune system. And before this hour is over, several of you will be joining Mr. Vance on the sidewalk." The 12 executives in the boardroom sat paralyzed, the air completely sucked out of the room. Elias Thorne did not raise his voice. The terrifying calm in his tone was enough to freeze the blood in their veins. He slowly reached into the pocket of his faded, slightly damp gray janitor's uniform and pulled out a small, encrypted black flash drive. He tossed it onto the center of the polished mahogany table. It landed with a sharp click that made several board members visibly flinch. "Do you know what the most fascinating thing about being a cleaner is?" Elias asked, his sharp gray eyes sweeping across the terrified faces of the corporate elite. "People treat you like furniture. You become entirely invisible, and when arrogant men believe no one of consequence is listening, they talk. They discuss illegal offshore accounts. They laugh about gutting employee pensions. They loudly orchestrate the deliberate sabotage of safety protocols to artificially inflate their quarterly margins." Richard Sterling, the senior board member, began to hyperventilate, his face turning an unnatural shade of chalky white. "Elias, please be reasonable. We were doing what was necessary for the shareholders. The market is ruthless right now. We had to make difficult choices to protect your legacy." "You did not protect my legacy, Richard. You cannibalized it," Elias countered smoothly, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper. You authorized Julian Vance to terminate the healthcare benefits of our warehouse workers while simultaneously voting to give yourselves a 30% executive bonus. I know this because I was emptying the shredder in your private office last Tuesday when you foolishly threw away the original, drafted addendums. A collective gasp ripped through the room. A woman at the end of the table, Margaret Holloway, attempted to stand, her hands shaking violently. Mr. Thorne, I had no part in that vote. I explicitly advised Julian against the aggressive restructuring. Sit down, Margaret, Elias ordered. The command carried the absolute crushing weight of a judge's gavel striking a sounding block. She collapsed back into her heavy leather chair instantly. You abstained from the vote, yes, but the audio recordings I secured from this very room indicate you agreed to look the other way in exchange for exclusive, off-the-books stock warrants. You are not innocent. You are simply a coward who wanted the profit without leaving your fingerprints. Elias stood up slowly, resting his calloused hands on the table, leaning forward to deliver his final, devastating judgment. This company was built on the sweat and loyalty of the people downstairs. You thought you were untouchable up here in the clouds. You thought the rules did not apply to you. But I am the law in this building. Elias pressed a silver button on the intercom system built into the boardroom table. Victoria, he spoke clearly, his voice echoing in the dead silence. Send up the federal auditors and building security. We have a lot of trash to take out. The heavy mahogany doors of the penthouse boardroom swung open with a resounding crack, shattering the remaining fragile illusions of power the executives clung to. Sergeant Barnes and Miller strode in, no longer hesitant, but radiating the uncompromising authority of men who had just been given the keys to the kingdom. Behind them marched a stern-faced phalanx of federal auditors, accompanied by heavily armed agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Secure all laptops, tablets, and mobile devices immediately, the lead federal agent ordered, his voice echoing sharply off the vaulted ceiling. Nobody deletes a single file. Nobody makes a phone call. Panic erupted in the previously untouchable sanctuary. Richard Sterling, the man who had orchestrated the ruthless Q3 restructuring, slumped back in his chair, his face completely devoid of color as two agents flanked him. Margaret Holloway began to sob hysterically, desperately attempting to shove her smartphone into her designer handbag before Miller smoothly intercepted it, placing it into a clear plastic evidence bag. Elias Thorne remained seated at the head of the table, his weathered hands resting quietly on the polished wood. The faded, damp gray janitor's uniform he wore was no longer a symbol of invisible servitude, but a terrifying mantle of absolute judgment. He watched with cold, detached satisfaction as the architects of Obsidian Corp's moral decay were systematically dismantled, handcuffed, and read their rights. You thought leadership was about standing on the necks of the people below you, Elias said softly, though the room had grown so quiet that every word resonated like thunder. You forgot that an empire without a strong, honest foundation will inevitably collapse, and I am the foundation. As the disgraced board members were marched out of the room in handcuffs, perfectly mirroring Julian Vance's humiliating exit earlier that morning, Elias slowly stood up. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the rain-swept skyline of Chicago. The dark storm clouds were finally beginning to break, allowing a single, piercing ray of morning sunlight to strike the glass tower. Victoria Sterling entered the room quietly, her tablet in hand. The entire building is secure, Mr. Thorne. The employees, they are celebrating in the lobby, sir. The morale has completely shifted. Elias smiled, a genuine, warm expression that finally reached his deep gray eyes. He picked up his worn company baseball cap from the table and placed it back on his silver hair. Good, Elias nodded, turning toward the door. Cancel all executive bonuses for this quarter and redistribute the funds to the lower-level staff as a hazard pay. Bonus for enduring Mr. Vance's regime. Oh, and Victoria? Yes, Mr. Thorne? Make sure someone mops the lobby, Elias said, a faint twinkle of humor in his voice. We wouldn't want anyone to slip on the wet marble.
Yeah, thanks.
With the rot finally excised and the corporate empire returned to its rightful creator, the silent janitor walked out of the boardroom, having delivered the ultimate devastating karma.